Hey, I'm Dave. Welcome to my shop. My name is Dave Plummer, and I'm the author of the book Secrets of the Autistic Millionaire. Today, I'll be reading you the first chapter called Burgers with Bill Gates, about the first time I ever met Bill almost 30 years ago. While the title might reasonably lead you to conclude that the book is primarily about financial success, it's actually not. It's really about leading a successful life with autism regardless of how you personally define success. The book contains everything I know now about living with autism that I wish I'd known when I was younger. The big idea then is to allow you to live your life with the benefit of my hindsight, and along the way, you'll learn a great deal about autism spectrum disorder, and I'll entertain you with stories of how ASD has impacted my own life. Along the way, we'll cover such topics as origins, symptoms, emotions, empathy, mind blindness, parenting, relationships, marriage, employment, making friends, your life's purpose, and even more. The book is not just for those who have ASD, though. It's also intended for those who love, live with, work with, or are friends with someone on the autism spectrum. I was diagnosed with autism by a neurologist who specializes in it about 3 years ago after some 12 hours of testing because diagnosing somebody with any accuracy takes time. You can't get diagnosed accurately from a web survey, so if you're not sure whether you might have ASD, one of the first things we'll do is to explore the symptoms of autism. And if enough of them ring true for you, you may wish to contact a trusted doctor for a referral to someone who specializes in ASD diagnostics. If your masking is any good whatsoever, there's a good chance that your own doctor won't have been able to spot it. I would be cautious about accepting their assurances that you do not have it, unless they are a specialist. With that out of the way, let's get on with the book. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel right now and to turn on personal notifications in order to make sure that you do see future installments of the book. Otherwise, you might never see another. Chapter 1. Introduction. Welcome to Autism. Burgers with Bill Gates. The first time I met Bill was almost 30 years ago in his backyard. A pair of burly security guards dressed in too tight purple Microsoft polo shirts politely escorted me through his home on the west side of Lake Washington. It was a mansion to my Midwestern eyes, though only a fraction the size of the more famous home he would later build sprawling across the hillsides of the lake's eastern shore. Windows 95 was still in the future, and I was at Microsoft working on the older operating system known as MS-DOS. I was just a temporary intern, not even a full-time blue badge employee yet, but back in those days, Microsoft was small enough to allow Bill to invite the top college prospects over for a backyard barbecue. Out on the lawn with a microbrew in hand, we all clustered around him, hoping to catch his interest in conversation. Each of us had no doubt prepared something clever to say, just in case the opportunity presented itself. Perhaps an insight about or criticism of a Microsoft product so perceptive or biting that he'd recognize our innate genius amongst the crowd and pluck us like a gem from the front lines. That was the daydream. The starker reality was that after our burger and beer, we'd be hurried out the front door and back to headquarters in Redmond to work another of our 16-hour days, competing directly against one another for the top spots. Everyone came from the best schools: MIT and Princeton in the United States, Waterloo in Canada. With over 100,000 job applications coming into Microsoft every year at the time, just being one of those 30 was an incredibly big deal, especially if you were from the University of Regina, like I was. That's in Saskatchewan, if that helps any, but either way, I was only really at Microsoft by virtue of having put myself through college on the proceeds from writing software for a competing computer platform. My program, Hypercache, had already sold a few thousand copies before it popped up on Microsoft's radar. My task now was to write something like it for their MS-DOS, releasing it for 100 million PCs instead of just a few thousand. If that went well, there was a good chance of a full-time spot upon graduation, complete with their famously lucrative Microsoft stock options. Failing that, I could always go back to my old job at 7-Eleven, and so you can see why I wanted to make a good first impression. We gathered in concentric circles around Bill as the setting sun glistened off the lake behind us. Few dared probe toward the center, where Bill himself stood alone, but I had an advantage with Ben, my manager. He knew Bill and seemed completely unfazed by fame or fortune. Ben pulled me straight through the gauntlet of would-be nerds and presented me directly to Bill as if I were a prized protege. He told him, "This is Dave, our intern from Canada." In the space of 4 months, and his voice trailed off to list the very real technical accomplishments that I had worked so hard to complete that summer. I listened in earnestness at first, but soon became highly distracted with one very real problem. It hadn't technically been 4 months, as Ben had said. It had only taken 3, not 4. It was a small thing, but an important detail. I was sure they'd want to know. I cleared my throat and spoke up and interrupted them with a correction. 3 months. Surprised, they both stopped, turned, and looked at me. My heart sank. Once again, as always, I had spoken out of turn, somehow saying just the wrong thing at precisely the wrong time. That much was obvious, and that was 3 decades ago. And yet, I just found out last week that I have autism. I wrote this part raw in the aftermath of that diagnosis to capture my early thoughts about it. Ben and I had long since moved on from Microsoft, and I had not seen him in several years. At some point along the way, he had been surprised by a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder for his own daughter, and apparently, after better understanding the symptoms and seeing them in the context of his own family, one of his early thoughts was Dave should get himself tested. Soon after, he took me for lunch and told me about his daughter's diagnosis, and without really being specific as to why, he encouraged me to investigate being tested for autism myself. I wasn't really bothered by the idea, but I was a bit confused as to what would lead him to think so. I went home and took the Autism Spectrum Quotient test online, and of a possible 50 points, I scored 40. Clearly, I thought, I must be answering the questions with personal bias, so I had my wife of 25 years sit down and make sure I was being accurate and honest. I retook the test with her to be sure that I did not exaggerate. My score went up, 42. For years, I had joked that I'm not on the autism spectrum, but you can see it from here. I later upgraded that to, I might be on the spectrum, but I'm on the non-visible portion. Still, I didn't really consider it possible. I'm empathetic, sensitive, emotional, funny, all things that I thought would preclude me from being anywhere on the autism spectrum. I booked the necessary appointments and over the course of a few weeks completed all the testing. I would have done better on the SAT and math sections with a little advanced practice, but going in cold as an adult was also interesting in its own right. It sure had been a long time since I'd done much long division. Preparing the full report took a few weeks, and my wife accompanied me to receive the results. The good news? Apparently, I'm reasonably clever, as in 3 standard deviations smart. On some portions of the cognitive testing, I even achieved perfection, something they'd apparently never seen before. But I was also slow. I got the right answer, but I took my own sweet time to get it. Each test runs to completion without you knowing the time limit, but they watch and record where you were at when the set time limit expired. I scored an estimated 1550 of 1600 on the SAT, but only if time wasn't considered. Had I been cut off at the official time limit, I would have only scored 1150, a fairly average score. The reason? Apparently, I have serious attention deficit disorder. Oh, and as noted, it also turns out that I have autism. More accurately, I was officially diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. As a doctor, my wife and I flipped through the pages of the report in unison. Terms like significant social dysfunction stared back at me. When we finally got to the autism-specific behavior section, my wife was pleased to note, well, at least the numbers are good here, far above average. But then the doctor corrected her. No, higher is worse. I used to be gifted, and now I had a diagnosis, and it had a better and a worse. That's about all I felt in those initial minutes. Not everyone appreciates popular media portrayals of autism, but we'll leave that aside for now to make use of 2 such examples as handy measuring devices. If I were forced to use a pop reference as perhaps the least accurate but most communicative way to express the amount of autism that I am affected by, I would say I have 80% as much as Sheldon Cooper on The Big Bang Theory. At current exchange rates, I'd estimate that makes me about 25% as autistic as the title character in the movie Rain Man. As you can guess, these are not professional metrics. They're numbers pulled from the air by a layman. From the actual test report, I can see that I'm more autistic than roughly 98.5% of the general population. While that might sound quite autistic, I'm still fairly high functioning. I don't use those terms a lot, however. I'm also highly impacted in many ways, which is what makes my balance point interesting, I believe. In short, I'm far enough into it to deeply understand the autism thought process that is normally inaccessible to neurotypical people, yet still conversant enough to explain back to everyone what they are missing, and even how this condition can be of use in their own lives at times. Hopefully, I can explain it to you. Unfortunately, as with many people on the spectrum, my brain is complicated in other ways as well. As noted earlier, I have significant attention deficit disorder, and My mother says she would add hyperactivity to the list, but I was never tested as a youth. I also, to my great regret, smoked cigarettes for 30 years and believe it was that stimulant that allowed me to manage my dopamine and stay focused for most of my adult life. This probably explains why the ADD only really came to light when I quit smoking, or while sitting without them for long exams, depositions, and so on. On top of this, I've also suffered from anxiety, which can be known to lead to bouts of depression if not well managed. Or could it be that these are all just aspects of my autism mischaracterized as unrelated anxiety and mood disorders for decades? These were among the questions I would attempt to answer for myself. Learning these things about myself didn't happen all at once. In fact, it's been a process of discovery over the course of more than 25 years, treating problems and issues whenever and wherever they arose without systematically looking for a deeper connection between them. That I did not eventually diagnose my own autism surprises me. I don't feel bad for missing it, however, given that for decades more qualified educators and professionals also overlooked the same symptoms. To be honest, however, I cannot blame them either. Over the years, I've become a master at masking, or the art of acting normal, which makes a diagnosis without specific testing even more difficult. Girls are reportedly even better at such masking, going undiagnosed even more often as a result. The good news is that this odd mix of brain disorder and ability has not caused my life to descend entirely into chaos. In fact, quite the contrary. Although it has been a wild ride at times for both myself and those around me, this exotic brain of mine has served me incredibly well. If you will briefly indulge some self-congratulatory details, I graduated at the top of my university with an engineering degree, although years late in starting it because I had dropped out of high school. I've made multiple fortunes many different ways, and I have invented, designed, and engineered products used daily by billions of humans around the globe. I've been issued half a dozen patents and started my own company in my own den that went on to achieve over $100 million in sales. I married my beautiful soulmate, raised 4 happy and successful children, and much more. And yet, for all this self-indulgent list of success, privilege, and grace, I still struggle with simple things like eye contact and conversation flow and relationships and anger and anxiety and meltdowns and a dozen other things that we shall soon turn to look at. It is only now, in retrospect, that I can look back and see specifically where certain aspects of my autism impacted me, for better and for worse, and it is here that I tell those stories. If I am successful, it will be because I not only explain and entertain, but I will have done so in a way that empowers you to apply some of those lessons learned to your own life, whether you are personally affected by autism or not. Because to be clear, life with some autism can be spectacular. If you've liked the story so far, please take a second to leave a like on the video so I know. Plus, it helps with engagement in terms of the algorithm, of course, and also, please consider picking up a copy of the paperback or ebook by checking out the Amazon links in the video description. Now, if you want to continue the story here, you're going to have to ensure that you're subscribed to the Autistic Millionaire Channel. I also recommend you turn on personal recommendations so that you don't miss those episodes, because subscribing doesn't actually mean that much anymore by itself. It helps in terms of the engagement and metrics, but if you actually want to see them, then you need the personal recommendations too. In case you're new to my content entirely and haven't seen the Dave's Garage series, check out that channel for episodes such as The Secret History of Microsoft Bob, Computer Language Drag Racing, and Stupid C++ Tricks. Thanks for joining me out here in the shop today. I'll be back soon with the next few pages. In the meantime and in between time, I hope to see you next time, right here in Dave's Garage.